Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to go into a little bit of a topic that I brought up a bit in my Spider-Man Far From Home trailer breakdown, but it's something that I kind of want to explore a little bit more because looking at it now, there's been so much setup for this thing that I think it needs further explanation and clarification, but I really like the idea that Marvel is going with, and I'm going to kind of counter explain a couple of things that's been going on with the MCU. So this is more of just a clarification video, and to kind of get my thoughts on this out there as it goes forward. Now, first of all, spoiler warning for if you have not seen Endgame or if you have not seen the trailer for Spider-Man Far From Home or the second trailer from Spider-Man Far From Home, this will contain information from both of those things. So again, if you don't want to be spoiled for Endgame, do not continue to watch this video. Now, uh, the whole thing is that, and they bring it up in the Spider-Man Far From Home trailer, and it's something that you can pick apart quite well, is the idea of the passing of the torch from Iron Man, who is now deceased after Endgame, to Spider-Man. And I think I went over it a little bit in the trailer breakdown, like I said before, where I think it's a really good idea, but there's so much setup to this that makes it work. Um, in the subsequent films before this, where Spider-Man shows up in Civil War, the character gets built upon for his solo outing in Spider-Man Homecoming, and then we have Infinity War and Endgame. Um, Now, just to go from the beginning, um, if this is actually Marvel's plan, if they're not just teasing this, if this is actually their plan, it is a brilliant one for how to replace Iron Man in terms of the popular character for the MCU. Because who better to replace your most popular MCU character with than your most popular all around character? Because Spider Man is the most popular character from Marvel, period. Whether it's the comics, obviously the only exception being the MCU at this point because he's just entered relatively recently. He's only been in the MCU since 2016. So, and also people kind of had Spider-Man fatigue and stuff after the Sam Raimi films and then the Amazing Spider-Man films, and now we have this. But people have gotten used to him more now hanging around with other superheroes because of the Avengers films. So going into this, we have this idea. So to start out from the beginning, and this is actually a retcon from the MCU that makes a lot of things very interesting, coming from the perspective of Peter Parker, because in real time, Tony Stark became Iron Man in 2008 MCU time, and at the time that he is killed in Endgame, it is 2023. So he has been Iron Man for 15 years at that point. Um, and that's a pretty extensive timeline for somebody who, at the time, I believe, was in his uh, early 30s or mid 30s. So he's closing in on 50 at that point. So bowing out, Robert Downey Jr. is even older than that in real life. They just make him look younger. But if you go back to the event, so if you go back to the events of Iron Man 2, now there's a specific scene, and I'm sure if people have heard, I believe Tom Holland, the actor who plays Spider-Man, actually clarified this one. Was at the end of Iron Man 2, there's Tony Stark has restarted the Stark Expo, and at the end of it, he's fighting these drones. And basically, at one point, there's this little kid in an Iron Man outfit. He has a little Iron Man glove with a glowing little light for a repulsor beam, and he has a little helmet on. And we can't see his face. We never do see his face. But he, does his little thing. He points the light thing at the drone. The drone's about to kill him, and then Iron Man comes down and it destroys the drone before it can kill the kid, and then he flies off and starts doing other stuff. Now, in that movie, that's really nothing more than just like a little cute moment. Okay, it's kind of funny because the kid thinks initially that he blew up the robot and stuff, but we find out later on that that was actually a very young Peter Parker, which would match up with the timeline because he's 14 in the events of Captain America: Civil War, which was 2016. So he would have been about 6 there, which again makes roughly around the right amount of sense for a kid that size, roughly 6, 7, 8 years old. But it sets in motion this idea that Peter Parker has always considered Iron Man his hero, because he grew up with him. And again, it's kind of the idea of almost like the comic books where you grow up with the comic books, except his hero really existed in terms of the fictional universe of the MCU. Iron Man existed. So Spider-Man then grows up with this image of Tony Stark as this great hero, and he gets to see all his exploits. He gets to see the Battle of New York. You know, he's in Queens, obviously. He's in New York during that. Um, that's a retcon that has a lot of ramifications going forward, and it leads you to think of so many things before Tony Stark goes to visit Peter Parker in Civil War, because again, it's 8 years later, so you don't, or actually, sorry, from 2010 it would be 6 years later. Um, so I changed my dates a little bit. Peter Parker would have been about 8, which again makes sense. But you look into what's going on with the characters in that, and now you have this whole thing established. If you look at it from that perspective, where Peter Parker is a big fan of Iron Man, that's his hero, and it makes even more sense when Peter meets Tony Stark. Obviously not just because he's a very public figure and everybody knows that he's Iron Man, but he's Star Trek. This is his hero. This is his personal hero. This is somebody who saved his life on an occasion. And they build that relationship up where then Iron Man recruits him, but Iron Man, or Tony Stark, also develops a bond with him, a fatherly type of bond, because he knows that Peter does not have a father. And again, they don't really mention Uncle Ben in the MCU films, so I mean, I don't know if Tony Stark knows about that incident. I'm sure he probably does, but they build up this relationship, and it builds even further through Spider-Man Homecoming, where Iron Man is kind of watching over him in a way throughout most of the film, and it applies discipline to him, again, like a fatherly figure. And we get to see this relationship develop over the Spider-Man solo film, to where Iron Man then respects him because he manages to right the ship by the end of it. But this is also the instant where Peter kind of comes into his own and rises himself up a bit more, where Iron Man believes that he's capable of joining the Avengers. And then, of course, in Infinity War, he actually does join the Avengers, although he gets dusted. And that leads to my next thing, is that you look at what happens throughout that movie, where Spider-Man has the banter back and forth with Iron Man. And again, there's more respect gained there. It's less a father talking to a son. I shouldn't say that. It's less a father talking to a child, and then versus a father talking to a young man. It develops to that point where there's more respect, where he can see that he's coming into his own, and he knows what he's doing now a bit more, and he can be trusted with more. And then, of course, we have the end of Infinity War, where Peter gets dusted, and that scene alone has so much character in it, where he's holding on to him and saying that he doesn't want to go, and he reverts back to that 15-year-old kid that's like, I just want to be a kid, I want to live my life, and he's having that ripped away from him. And we have the opposite moment in Endgame, at the end of the film, when everybody gets brought back for the final battle, and Peter and Tony just happen to meet each other on the battlefield, and Tony, without even saying a word, kind of just looks at Peter and then just hugs him. There's almost no, Peter starts talking, but there's no words exchanged from Tony, really, and Tony just hugs him, and just, again, it's, Tony views Peter almost like a surrogate son at that point. And after 5 years of knowing that he's been dead, that he's been gone, and for Peter it's been an instant. For Peter, it was like he stepped out and stepped back in. But for Tony, it's been 5 years, 5 years of agonizing over it. And we see it again in the beginning of Endgame, when Tony finds a picture of Peter Parker's little Stark Grant, whatever you want to call it, where he's posing with Peter, and kind of a goofy photo, but it gets him to get his head back in the game, basically, to say that he owes this to Peter Parker. He owes this to everybody who got snapped out of existence by Thanos. He owes it to the world. And Peter Parker was the catalyst to that, because Tony Stark cares so much about him. And then, of course, we have the parting moment at the end of Endgame, which is the opposite of what happens in Infinity War, where Tony Stark dies after using the Infinity Gauntlet. And Peter Parker is just, he's trying to tell himself that it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. And then, Obviously Tony dies. We see him at the funeral, obviously, with Aunt May and every other person who was in the MCU. But now we go into Far From Home, and we've had this entire relationship where essentially Peter has been growing up in Iron Man's shadow, and now Iron Man is gone, and Peter is just there. And we have this interaction where he's kind of getting more in touch with Tony Stark's people, like Happy Hogan. There's a very touching moment in the trailer where Happy Hogan and Peter Parker have this monologue about, and Happy basically tells Peter that Tony Stark wouldn't have done what he had done. He wouldn't have used the gauntlet unless he wouldn't have done it unless he knew that somebody like Peter was there to pick up where he left off. And this is essentially why Spider-Man Far From Home is such an important film for this series, because if they go off on the wrong foot on this, then you could see a monumental catastrophe on your hands, because this is the next step in the MCU. This is the next beginning, and you've seen them kind of bringing in these newer characters in Phase 3, where you have Doctor Strange and Black Panther, and even though Ant-Man was technically Phase 2, you bring in Ant-Man, you have the Wasp, you have Spider-Man, you have all these characters that are coming in. There's going to be even more of them in the future, and kind of the older characters either bowing out or taking a step back. So you have this kind of changing of the guard, but the big one is Iron Man, because he is always, Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark has always been the face of the MCU since the beginning. And now you need to find something to replace him. And you have built this up through films. And for people that have been paying attention to the films, you can tell that they were building this up. And now that they're doing this, now that they're bringing Spider-Man to the forefront, it's something that I think is the only choice that they can make, and it's the right choice. Because so many people were saying, "Oh, Captain Marvel is going to be the new face of the MCU." Captain Marvel, no, it's going to be Spider-Man. It is going to be Spider-Man. Spider-Man is going to replace Iron Man as that head character that they want to head up, and that is a brilliant idea, because Spider-Man has had a resurgence in recent years because of the MCU Spider-Man with Tom Holland, because of like movies like Into the Spider-Verse from Sony, and stuff like that. Everybody likes Spider-Man now again. They're not tired of him like they were in 2014. Everybody likes him again. And that's why this is such a smart choice, because you're going to start off the whole new phase with this new Spider-Man, and you're going to send him on this adventure, and you're going to have him step up to the plate, and you're going to have him take the place of Tony Stark. And that's what's going to propel this new phase of the MCU forward. Now, what they do after that is going to be, is essentially going to be riding the wave that's created by this movie, and how well this movie does, not just financially, but in terms of reception. Um, but like I said, given the narrative, I think this is the perfect idea, and if you watch the narrative, it's the perfect choice. And I like the dynamic that they're able to do with this, because that's how it's supposed to work. So yeah, this looks like the direction that they're going to go, and I enjoy that direction, at least from the aspect that they're going for from uh, the new series of films. Um, and again, you have other subsequent characters that are coming up as well, like Doctor Strange and Black Panther and yada yada yada, and any other ones that are introduced, uh, after this point, which I think there's going to be a substantial amount, obviously, because they have Fantastic Four and X-Men now. So that's just my thoughts on this, but it's interesting to look through the timeline and some of the little retcons that have been done, and look at the relationship between Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and kind of just realize that this has kind of been a long thing coming, even though it's a bit subtle if you don't pay attention to the series of films. So what do you think about having Spider-Man take the forefront in the MCU? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Put it in the comments. Leave a like on the video. Hit the bell for notifications. Subscribe. And remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?